We're going to go ahead and get started tonight. This is the next installment of the Northern Virginia Family Practice Town Hall series. This is actually the mental fitness series that we're working on called Mind Over Matter. And I'm Dr. Cecily Havert, and tonight we have with us again Francine Ronis, who is a therapist who actually was on our program last summer, right when the COVID pandemic was just kind of fresh and new, and we were talking a little bit about how we were dealing with that, with our emotions and anxiety, and now we're about a year in, so a lot has evolved. We're probably in a slightly different place now than we were back then. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more this evening about trauma, but also healing from trauma. I'd like to think of this as a hopeful type of discussion, but we'll delve just a little bit deeper into the idea of trauma, what the definitions of trauma, and also how the COVID pandemic could be viewed somewhat as a traumatic experience. I think we all can kind of relate to that idea a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Francine Ronis. Francine Ronis is a licensed professional counselor. She practices in Virginia. She's been practicing for over 20 years. She works with both adults and children. She's also a parent coach and consults in schools and businesses throughout the area. Her focus is social emotional health for children and families, mindfulness, and empowering clients to find their true self. Recent events have prompted her to delve more deeply into the fields of trauma and resiliency to help clients thrive. So we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Francine here in a minute, but one thing I will mention is that unfortunately the chat feature is not enabled during this video. So we are going to have, we'd like to invite participation. So what we're going to have to do is you're going to have to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself when we get to the question and answer portion or the sharing portion of this. I understand that if you don't want to have to share verbally, you can always email us later and ask us private question as well. But unfortunately, I'm not sure what happened with the chat function, but it is not present tonight. So anyway, we will turn it on over to Francine.
You know, as you were introducing me, I was thinking, I heard you say back the words that I had, told you that I've recently been delving more into trauma, and that's true. And yet, as I think about the work I've done for so many years working with children and families, that's actually been in the prevention of trauma. And we'll talk a little bit about how positive attachment builds resilience to being able to expand your window of tolerance and things like that. So, if we were in a room together, I would ask how many of you feel like COVID has been a traumatic experience for you? And yeah, so I don't see many of you on camera, but the few of you on camera are saying, yeah, and I agree. Like for me, it's been incredibly difficult. And I think that many of us don't, when we hear trauma, we don't think, oh, we're in trauma, because we think of trauma as an earthquake or experiencing violent crime or things that are big one-time events, war, right? We hear of PTSD, that diagnosis came about when veterans came back from fighting wars. And what we know now is that all of us have experienced trauma on different levels. And they sometimes call it big T trauma, like a big event, or little t trauma, like small events. But those small events can really add up to something that creates a lot of intense feelings and maybe an inability to really act in the world the way you're accustomed to acting. And that has happened with COVID. Many of us have a hard time deciding what to make for dinner, or whether or not we have the energy to go for a walk that we normally go for a walk. A year in, we might not have the energy, and those could be a sign of experiencing trauma, because the long-term impacts of being in isolation for a year and being in fear and worry and having every decision that we make really sometimes be a matter of life and death. can really have a cumulative impact and have you feeling like not the person that you know yourself to be. And that's what we'll talk about with kind of a, can I just go into kind of the window of tolerance and jump around some?
Feel free. Let's do it. Yeah.
How we know that we're kind of having a trauma risk. I have all these notes and then I go off book all the time. Um, Window of tolerance is what we call our ability to respond, our ability to think and feel at the same time, or hold more than one feeling at the same time. So if you think of maybe, um, your pet gets sick, and you get afraid and worried, but you also know, okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to call the vet. I'm going to make an appointment, and I'm going to take care of this. That's within your window of tolerance. You can feel and think and act at the same time. But when we have either cumulative effects of trauma or a big trauma, often we can't act. We hear people say, maybe you're in shock or something like that, where we can't think, we can't hold more than one emotion, and we can't usually act in a rational way. And, over a prolonged period of time, that may not look like you're not able to cook dinner, but it may look like I said, like you want to go for that walk, but you just can't do it. And it's been 3 weeks, or the things that you're normally able to do aren't, or you're startled a lot, or having bad dreams, or not able to sleep, or you're quick to anger or quick to cry. Like those are all signs that you're out of your window of tolerance. And bye, be safe. um, those are all signs that you might be out of your window of tolerance and that you're having a response to trauma. And I think that hearing that is sometimes difficult for people because, like I said, you either don't want to think, well, I haven't had something horrible happen to me, or it feels overwhelming to even admit that you might be having a traumatic response. But that deep grief, that anger, all those feelings that it can be so overwhelming and hard to kind of climb out of could be signs that, you have trauma. And and when we talk about trauma, like COVID alone might put you into a traumatic response, especially if the circumstances are extreme, like you had a loved one who passed and you couldn't be with them, or you're isolated where you're not accustomed to being isolated, things like that. But very often, trauma is in layers. And when we're younger, both when we're children and even as we get older, when something big happens that we can't process, it goes into our cells. It goes into our cells, our muscles, and our brain as energy and as unprocessed emotion. And there's just been an incredible amount of research lately, in the past 20 years, mostly a lot of it, many of you may have heard of Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's really groundbreaking research in that we hold these emotions in our body, and then something will trigger them. Maybe it's a car accident, maybe it's a divorce, maybe it's the loss of somebody, maybe it's a pandemic. But it will trigger a response that feels bigger and deeper than you might think would happen from the one event. And that's often the layers of trauma that are unresolved coming up because now we have the capacity to process them. Whereas when we're younger, we just didn't have the capacity to process them. So we kind of shoved them away. So some of you may be feeling that. You may be feeling the effects of many, many years of unresolved events or even prolonged trauma that are just coming out now. And we talk about 3 levels of trauma. We talk about acute, which is the one-time event, right? The natural disaster, the crime, the loss of somebody. And then we talk about chronic, which is something like living in an abusive situation. And that could be mentally abusive, emotionally abusive. We often think of physical abuse, but there's many kinds of abusive situations that people live in. Neglect, poverty, being the victim of racial injustice. Those are all chronic trauma that accumulate. And then there's complex trauma, which often originates in early childhood, where you don't have a secure attachment to your caregivers and there's neglect and abuse and things like that. So it's not just the one time that you might think. And just being aware of that has become really important in all kinds of places. Even there's even, yoga, trauma informed yoga, because people can be triggered very easily and not know it just by putting their body in a certain position or being told to do something that's uncomfortable. So we're really looking at, in so many professions, ways of understanding trauma and being sensitive. So you might hear a yoga teacher saying, and if that posture doesn't feel okay to you, do whatever feels good. Put a blanket covering you, or put your hand on your heart, or move in a different way, because it's really important to understand that we're all different and we don't know everybody's story. So I know, I kind of jumped around, but.
No, that's a great introduction to some of the key topics that we were interested in talking with. I think, or talking about. I know that sort of defining what is trauma. There's big trauma, and then there's little trauma. But a lot of times the emotions that we feel are very similar between different types of events. And so for something like, for like COVID-19, this pandemic that has really put a lot of stress on us. And in some ways you could think it's actually kind of shrunk our window of tolerance. So how does COVID-19, or how does the pandemic, now that it's shrinking our window of tolerance, how does that, for people who've had, trauma in the past, how can that be even harder for some of these people?
Yeah. Well, and I want to be really clear that when we talk about big T and little t, big trauma and little trauma, there is no measurement. Like, your experience of whatever you're going through is never in comparison to whatever I'm going through or anybody else's, because everybody's window of tolerance is different, and everybody's experience is different, and everybody's resiliency is different. So sometimes we can do that. We can compare and say, well, what I experienced wasn't as bad as what somebody else did. And that's a disservice to everybody. With COVID-19, our window of tolerance has for most of us has gotten much smaller, because we don't have a lot of the coping mechanisms that we often have, like going to our jobs and feeling competent, working within the illusion that we have control, right? Most of us spend our days pretending we have control, that we're going to get in our car, we're going to get to work, we're going to get home. And of course, that's an illusion. We don't know what's going to happen, but we operate in that way because that's how we get through our day. And that was sort of taken away from us. And everything became much more tenuous, with the idea that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when this is going to end. We don't know if we're going to get it. We don't know if we get it, how bad it's going to be, and if we're going to pass it. So we see people having much bigger responses to events that happen. Maybe, locking their keys in their car, and all of a sudden they're screaming and crying, instead of just like, oh, I can't believe I locked my keys in my car. Or, we're seeing divorce rates go up. We're seeing abuse, a lot more of domestic abuse, child abuse, things like that, because people don't have coping mechanisms available to them anymore that they normally do to kind of get through their day. And then you might have early trauma being triggered by the loss of control that most of us feel with the pandemic. I think that's been one of the hardest things for people, is the loss of control.
And just being okay with that. I think that that's something that, we really, really value, is being in control of, the decisions that we make, and, just how we go about our life. And that's been taken away. And I think it's also important to point out that the social isolation and just being away from our loved ones, I think that builds resiliency, or just, those relationships that, that we've had since we were younger, and not being able to be with these people. I think that's a coping mechanism that I think has been taken away from a lot of us.
It has, and it is a marker of resiliency, right? Strong social relationships and strong attachment in early childhood is one of the most important markers of resiliency.
Can you speak a little bit more about resiliency and how that, and how some people more resilient than others, and how we can actually build our resiliency?
Sure. So resiliency, there's a number of factors. Resiliency is the ability to handle events and situations. It's also the ability to kind of gain strength, knowledge, and growth from the difficult experiences that we have. And in most spiritual traditions, the idea that our purpose here is to change and grow and to evolve. That is the basis of many spiritual practices. And so the idea that our hard times change us is an important one. So some of the factors of resiliency are genetics, and they have shown genetics to be kind of play a small part in your resiliency. I want to make sure I don't miss any. Your history. So what you've been through in your life, starting from when you were little. Did you have a secure attachment? Having a secure attachment to your primary caregiver is a really good marker of resiliency. Understanding that you're safe in the world when you're little helps you have the ability to get through your difficult times with positive coping mechanisms, as opposed to some of the negative coping mechanisms that we develop. Your history. How many traumatic events were there? And some of us had things that we don't remember. You might find out at some point, oh yeah, when you were 5, you were in a car crash, but you didn't remember it, but your body remembers it on some level. Environment. What kind of environment did you grow up? Did you grow up in an environment where there was enough food, enough money, enough resources, enough attention, enough love, or not? And that's where, that this is a whole other conversation, but that's where we see racial inequality very often in the resilience piece, is what environmental traumas were there, and also being, racial injustice adds to that trauma, and that's all part of it. Situational context. So what we make of a situation, which kind of fits along with optimism, right? If somebody is, I'm going to sneeze and I'm trying not to. Excuse me. Social context. So situational context, how we see a situation. Sometimes you're with somebody and, you have completely different views of the same situation. And so if somebody that can see it in a positive light has more resiliency than somebody that, maybe think of Eeyore and who's the guy that hops?
Tigger.
Tigger, right?
Tigger, right? Yeah.
Tigger. So Tigger has way more resiliency than Eeyore, right? Tigger is always looking at the positive, and Eeyore is like, oh, this is horrible no matter what it is. Close relationships, and then learn skills. What skills have you learned growing up and in your life to get through things? Do you have parents that say, oh, I'm sorry, that's so horrible? Or do you have parents that say, yeah, that's really hard, and here's some things we can do about it? How are we going to handle this situation? So those all add to, your resiliency, and some of those you just can't control, right? You can't control your history or your attachment to your primary caregivers, but you can, there's other things that are in your toolbox that you can control. And some of that is optimism, right? You can build your optimism muscle by changing how you look at things, and you can actually, change the pathways in your brain if you stop and think, how can I see the good in this situation? How can I take the positive in this situation and turn it around, or the negative and turn it around to a positive? So that's one skill that you can work on. And gratitude is a great way to work on that resiliency skill. Gratitude has been shown to be one of the number one, not only builders of resiliency, but like builders of just feeling good, and noticing the good and having a better outlook in life is if you have some kind of gratitude practice. Having a good moral compass is a great tool for your toolbox. So understanding what's right and what's wrong and acting on that. Having a strong root in some kind of spiritual practice, whatever that is for you. Having cognitive and emotional flexibility, right? So not being rigid in your thinking and seeing things in one way, and having the ability to handle and experience the different emotions and not kind of get stuck in one.
I think the flexibility piece is a big one for COVID right now, just because I think we've had to be incredibly flexible and bend around and, in ways that we, didn't think that we had to. And that was putting a lot of stress on all of us. So I think that's where maybe some of the, our window of tolerance, it may not be as big, is because, we've been forced to be more flexible than maybe we are. So.
Right. Certainly than is comfortable. And most of us have proven that we can do it. What we're seeing now, and what we're going to continue to see, I think, is sort of as spring comes and people stop and they really think and process how hard winter was, it's kind of a slowing down and a realization that what we went through collectively and individually was just incredibly difficult and more than most of us have ever experienced before. And for some people, it is going to feel like coming out of war, and that we are going to need to really understand that people need treatment options and need time and need care to process and move through this as a trauma, and not just kind of get over it and go back to normal, because then we're shoving down that trauma to come up later. So that's a really important piece. There were kind of two more in toolbox tools for resiliency. One was altruism, like doing for others and having that, getting out of your own head sometimes, and just realizing that you can always do something for somebody else, no matter how bad things are. And the ability to appraise situations realistically, right? To not go into, oh my gosh, this is horrible, I can't, like, there's usually some way out, even if it's just a baby step that you can take. So those are things we can change, whereas the earlier pieces were, kind of already written for us.
And, you're speaking to, some of the trauma and some of the experiences that people have gone through. I think everybody's kind of gone through, they've gone through their own experience. Some people probably more traumatic than others. Can you speak at all about healthcare providers? Just being a healthcare provider myself, and I have a lot of colleagues, and just in watching my peers go through this, I mean, it's been very challenging. And I think we're realizing now just how intense and how much healing is probably going to have to occur, because we were sort of, at the front lines of this whole, from the get-go.
Yeah, you have been on the front line. If I were to ask you, what was the hardest part about this for you as a healthcare provider? I mean, I can guess what you would say, but what would be the hardest thing for you?
I think one of the hardest things for me was, this is a completely new virus. We didn't know how to treat it well. We felt helpless. We felt like we couldn't help people. And I think from a healthcare provider, one thing that we really, feel secure about is that we know how to help people. We know what to do. And this time we didn't. And we did our best. And, we couldn't see people in the office. I mean, everything that we felt secure about how we do our job wasn't there anymore. Yet people were still looking to us for the answers. And we were trying our best to give them. But it was hard. I mean, yeah, no, it continues to be hard. But that's my perspective. That's what I found the hardest about this whole thing.
That's what I would have guessed, is feeling helpless. Yeah. Yeah, because your job is literally to help people. And even though, you started to be able to help them physically, still, I mean, as a therapist, there's not a lot I can do other than help people feel their feelings and know that they're normal and they're okay, but I can't take them away. And that's always been the case, right? And you've always had the case where you may have felt helpless, but this is so much of the time, right? And I think as healthcare providers, not only were people feeling helpless, but they were so taxed physically, emotionally, spiritually, energetically. Like, it was, for so many healthcare providers, crisis all the time, nonstop, at work, and having, and going to work and being first responders and having to do all that while you were all dealing with your own emotional responses to COVID and having to take care of your families, right? So
Yeah, no, it definitely was a test. I mean, I think, just we all, came together. I mean, there's a lot of, again, when I sort of look back at this, you do grow. I mean, from these traumatic and stressful moments, you definitely do grow. You learn from it. Part of the things that I think are great that came out of this is, especially with the practice, when we kind of shut down and we weren't able to see patients, one of the things Northern Virginia Family Practice was really worried about was staying connected, was being able to educate and stay connected with our patients. And so this is one reason why the town hall was born, just so we could communicate, because we really felt that we were cut off. So and that's a great thing. And I love these are, something that I hope to continue. And I think it's actually been very beneficial as a whole. And so there are some good things that have come out of it, but it definitely has, we've really had to lean into our resiliency and find, our flexibility and changing. Just, we've all had to do that in our lives, but.
right,
Yeah.
right.
So.
But you all, I think, in some ways, more than others, because you had to respond, and you had to respond on a physical level, and then, right, your job, you found ways to pivot. And medical professionals and teachers, right? Educational
Teachers, yeah.
both
Shout
had to
out to the
find,
teachers out there. And right now, with all the kids going back to school right now, I mean, this has really been a tough year.
yeah. And they keep pivoting and finding ways to figure it out and do the best they can in the hardest situation they've ever been in, right? And yeah, like you said, now, first it was, now we have to do virtual, now we have to do virtual and in person, and somehow it's just an incredible amount of stress, all while you're dealing with your own stuff and taking care of your family all at the same time. So it just feels exponential for frontline workers, I would imagine.
Yeah. And in terms of just dealing, I mean, we've all, we're all carrying a lot. I sort of describe it as the weight of COVID. I think we're all feeling it, and especially after this winter. And I think it is going to take some time to heal and, some time to process everything that's happened. I mean, I think it is, I am optimistic with, with the vaccines and things starting to open up. I am, I'm very happy that we're going to be in a place that we're going to, be able to heal. We're going to be in a safe place, able to heal. What are some other things that we can do now that we're, sort of emerging? So, I mean, there's, some people have looked to therapists, so therapy can help, but you said that, it can only help so much sometimes because it's just, I think part of it is just sort of recognizing our emotions and, and accepting them is part of it. And, leaning into that and accepting, yeah, this is hard. And
That, that's a really important one, because in our culture, we are not taught to lean into those hard emotions. We are taught to push them away, to stuff them down, to ignore them in every way possible, whether that's just working or pushing on or drinking or eating or watching TV, like anything but feel those tough emotions. And so that really important part is what's kind of called befriending those emotions. We have to have a relationship with difficult emotions if we want to transmute them into something else. If we want to take that energy and be done with it, we have to fully feel it and have a relationship with it and understand it. And boy, that can be really, really hard because there's not a lot of people you can share the depth of that emotion with often. And it can feel, this is one of the things I've been really working with is we're kind of taught to go home and deal with it ourselves. And that can turn into shame and feeling very alone in those emotions. Like nobody else is lying on their bed just crying for hours, or nobody else is unable to make dinner, and nobody else is, and that can turn into shame. And so if we have a way to process the emotions, if we think about indigenous cultures and we think about what our ancestors did, they gathered around the fire and they told stories every night. They shared stories and they shared experiences, and they danced and they sang and they howled at the moon, and they beat on drums, and they moved those experiences. They moved the running from the tiger, or the whatever happened in the village. They moved it out through story and song and movement and sharing. And so sometimes when we sit in a therapy room and we just tell the story over and over again, it actually is re-traumatizing, and it can make that neuropathway of negativity even stronger. So what we're finding with people like Dr. Vanderkoff, and people like Peter Levine and Janina Fisher and other people that are at the forefront of therapies that involve the somatic experience, the moving the energy out of the body, the noticing what your body does when you hold your breath, when you're feeling something in your body and really noticing it and be able to work with it. So using things like gatherings when we can do that, and even if it's through Zoom, movement, dance, storytelling, drumming, sound healing, meditation, things like that can really help what they call kind of transmute or alchemize the trauma. And it's hard for me to explain that, but we're all energy. We're made up of energy, and these emotions are energy too. And so if we move them out in these various ways, we kind of move through them, and then we can work with the thoughts also that come with it. Like working, once you're grounded and you're back in your window of tolerance, right? And we can use medication to do that too. We're back in our window of tolerance. Then we can work with our thoughts. Oh, nobody else feels this bad. Well, is that really true? Well, no, of course that's not true. Lots of people feel this bad. They're just not talking about it, or they're handling it in a different way, or I'm such a failure, I didn't make dinner. Well, how can you be kinder to yourself and say, okay, I didn't make dinner? Big deal. There's lots of times that it's okay not to make dinner, and I can be kinder to myself. So once we're back in that window of tolerance, we can kind of use tools of cognitive behavioral therapy to reprogram our brain to stop making us feel so bad.
I think also, one of the big things, and I think you touched on this, is labeling our feelings in that moment. I find that, if you can take a step back in the moment and label your frustration, your anger, sometimes that takes some of the power away from it. And
Yeah.
so I think that can be an important aspect of that too. But
yeah.
That's,
the basics of teaching little kids what their feelings are, right? And to say, I'm angry. Yeah, I can see you're angry, as opposed to not letting them express it. Yeah.
Well, one thing, I want to get to some questions, but one thing I want to do, you made some, alluded to, drum therapy and bells and gongs, guided meditation. There's a video that you shared with me earlier, and I was wondering if this would be an okay time to share that. If I'm technically advanced enough to do that.
I know you are. I know
Okay,
you are.
all right. I appreciate that. Okay, so you might have to turn, if people have their volumes down, you might have to turn it up
Yeah,
to actually hear this.
let me introduce her first.
Yes, please
Okay?
do.
So, a friend of mine, Janine, she's a healer on many levels, and she does sound healing. And so she's just trained to use sound to move energy out of the body. And it's really quite an amazing experience to work with her. And she's been training in this for years. And so we're going to show a video. It really doesn't do justice of what it's like to be in a sound bath or a sound meditation or a sound healing with her, but you physically feel different after it.
So I would invite everybody to maybe, close your eyes and just listen to this and think about how you feel before, and then maybe think about how you feel during or after the experience. So. Okay, all right. So that was very interesting. Can you describe a little bit about some of the what that does for the psyche?
Yeah, I wish she had used the gong, because the gong just reverberates through every cell of your body. It's amazing. I can I can even fall asleep with the gong, even though it's so loud. But you know, um, I asked her to describe it because it's not my expertise. But she said, sound vibration itself has the power to shift our mental state, release stress from the body, calm the nervous system, improve quality of sleep, and allow us to enter deep states of relaxation or meditation. Ancient universal sound has been used for healing, ceremony, and wellness throughout time and history. In our current experience, sound holds an important role in stress management and healing as a complementary practice to other modalities.
Great. It's great just to have other options that that we may not necessarily think of.
It
Um,
is. I mean, I think about there's a couple of dance programs that aren't follow how, but five rhythms or Koya are movement modalities that are done in a group that can be very healing. um Thinking, even like yoga, things that are very grounding, and they and what these things do besides having a physical effect, they help you they help you not think about everything else for a little while. And that's really good for your brain that wants to continue to problem solve when there's no problem solving to be done, you know?
yeah. Well, Francine, one thing that you were saying is that you've pivoted a little bit in how you're treating your clients and ways to help people. Now you're also starting a new program, these Resiliency Circles that you mentioned. So can you talk a little bit about some of these new programs that you're trying to get off the ground?
Yeah, it's super exciting. So what I started really looking at was what are the ways that we are processing trauma and how do we do a better job? And I started to really understand that how much we lost when we lost community, right? We lost our fire circles and we lost our red tents and all the things that brought people together to process, when we lost living with elders that gave us advice and shared their stories and helped build that resiliency. And then the other modalities, the energy work and the sound and the breath and things like that. So I'm and it started with talking to a healthcare worker and hearing how horrible it was to be on the front line and how stressful it was to be so responsible and to be so helpless, and then to go home in isolation and not have anybody to talk to and share with, and fear of spreading it either to the hospital or from the hospital, and just so much. And started thinking that they needed to tell their story. They needed people to hear their story. So I'm putting, using people that have much more knowledge of sound healing and energy work and things like that, but bringing together groups of individuals with the same experience. So healthcare workers or education workers or women, and we hope to expand, but kind of coming together in a block of time. Right now it's 4 hours to have a sharing around the fire and to have somebody come and do sound healing and meditation and move the breath and the trauma through, and then build up our resiliency piece. So bringing together community, storytelling, movement, sound to open up like that healing experience and to create that community where we can start to process COVID and the other things that are going on, right? The other injustices that have always been here but are really at the forefront of our consciousness right now. Um, just to start that movement in that direction. And I just hope to hold them, whether it's in people's backyards or at retreat centers, or just to have a lot of them to start to bring people together to share in this experience of moving through what we've all shared.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of healing that needs to happen. Everybody has their own journey and their own healing that needs to happen, and so this is it sounds like a very unique and special way that that might be helpful for people. So
It's unique to
um,
this time. It's
yeah.
it's you know it's age old, but it's a way to sort of bring that back. Like I didn't make it up. I just realized, oh, we're missing this.
And
Yeah.
just sort of reconnecting. I think that, and one thing that COVID has done, which is interesting, is that it has kind of slowed us down a little bit. I think that's something that I especially heard, when we weren't, we couldn't do running from one thing to the next. We weren't able to travel. It really slowed things down a little bit. And in some ways that can be good. But in other ways, you know, we did lose a lot with the changes.
It slowed things down, but it also, for so many of us, we became busier than ever.
True. It's like a vacuum, right?
Yeah, I never have before had, 3 meetings scheduled at the same time because I couldn't be 3 places, but now I can be 3 places, right? I can just be in my house and be in 3 places. So it has slowed down a lot, and it's also placed an incredible amount of stress, especially on what we're calling frontline medical, teachers, educators, therapists, grocery store workers, right? Like it's
People,
what?
the delivery workers.
Delivery workers, right? Yeah, it's put an incredible amount of stress on people like that. So and for me, the idea that we're just going to go back to normal, or we're just going to be done with this and people are going to just sit with it in their system feels, it feels like a really bad idea and an opportunity lost to um to really use this to build our resiliency and to bring us together.
I agree. So I guess let the healing begin. So we'll see how things go. And it's 8 o'clock. So I guess we're going to wrap things up. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to kind of shout it out. Otherwise, we are going to just wrap things up now. I think usually what happens is that these events are recorded and we're going to post them on our website. I would like to add some extra links to maybe some of the, maybe in our articles about resiliency, articles about windows of tolerance, and maybe some information about some of Francine's resiliency circles workshops that she's doing, if anybody's interested in learning more. So.
And I'll link to Janine, who does the sound. That really didn't do any justice to what she does, and she's in Northern Virginia.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks for your patience with my lack of chat and technical difficulties, but we're rolling with it. So anyway, well, good night. Once again, thank you so much for attending. And we have our next town hall meeting coming up in about 3 weeks. So we'll have a dermatologist talking about skin cancer and prevention. Great. So, okay. All right. Well, we'll see you next time. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. Have a good evening.